Israeli armor moving up to the Lebanese border for yet another showdown with pro-Iranian militiamen. Hours later, Lebanese military sources claim the Israelis had advanced beyond their self-declared security zone. Before the day's end, more blood would be spilt on both sides. As the convoys entered South Lebanon, cars were reported to be jamming the highway to Beirut as the local press warned people of an impending Israeli invasion. Unusually, Israeli army officers were giving wide publicity to the deployment, apparently hoping the show of force would deter the Hezbollah militiamen. From the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, there was no immediate comment. However, a veiled warning that anti-Israeli action would not remain unpunished came from Foreign Minister Shimon Peres.
Israel never took any initiative to attack anybody in Lebanon. All the steps that Israel took were either to react or to prevent attacks against them. We don't have the slightest interest to attack anybody or to provoke anything.
The two Arab states immediately concerned may have thought otherwise. They were Lebanon and Syria, which maintains 40,000 troops in Lebanon. Yet Israeli soldiers were the first victims of a new onslaught by Hezbollah forces based in Lebanon. 5 were killed and 5 wounded. However, Israel's response further raised the stakes and the number of casualties. It also increased tensions between the new Israeli administration and Arab states. But most of all, perhaps, it threatened the latest round of Middle East peace negotiations in the United States. In Jerusalem, large numbers of Israelis were demanding Rabin's Labour government suspend the talks. Ironically, Palestinians, angered at the lack of progress achieved in 13 months, also want them stopped. But as tempers flared on home ground and in Israeli-held territories, notably the West Bank and Gaza Strip, Israel's Prime Minister said the peace process must go on.
The government of Israel has to do the utmost to explore in these two fields, with Syria, with the Palestinians in the territories, the possibility to move in the peacemaking process. And I believe that within 6 to 12 months, we'll see something moving.
For many Palestinians, however, now was the time for mourning and defiance. A few weeks earlier, hundreds of Arab prisoners went on hunger strike for improved conditions in Israeli jails. Just 2 days after the strike was suspended, one died of heart failure. The simmering violence that's marked the 5-year-old Intifada flared up again, and the prisoner's death increased the sense of foreboding as peace negotiators prepared to leave for Washington.
Very clearly, this is a tragic incident, and I'm sure it will be felt very deeply by the Palestinian people as a whole, in the same way as the deaths of the Palestinian young people daily now for the last 2 weeks has been felt in a very personal and a very painful way by the Palestinians.
November the 9th, and the streets of Gaza are empty as people close shop for a monthly ritual. Every month, Palestinians still mark the day when the Intifada began. Gone the optimism that swept through the occupied territories when the peace process started in Madrid just over a year ago. Palestinians are growing increasingly impatient. They want their own independent nation. Lebanese negotiators have warned Israel must stop stalling.
We risk of becoming bogged down until such a time that the Israelis recognize that they are an occupying power and that this occupation has to be addressed, and this will not be the end of the road.
Syria agrees.
So the Israeli delegation is still locked behind the concept of the nature of peace and the concept of secure and recognized boundaries, while neglecting to commit itself to what is required under Resolution 242 and 338.
A Hezbollah parade marking Martyrs' Day in Lebanon. Hardliners are gaining ground. The peace negotiators are keenly aware of this. After more than a decade, the Palestinians' main adversary has yet to agree to United Nations resolutions demanding a return to pre-1967 borders. Perhaps the time has come to compromise. The rise of Muslim fundamentalism throughout the region makes the need for a settlement more urgent than ever before. Today, Palestinians in the occupied territories mark with protest every landmark in their struggle against Israeli rule. Here they were celebrating the 4th anniversary of the unilateral declaration of their own state by the Palestine National Council. Despite the risk of arrest and worse, it was an occasion most young Palestinians didn't want to miss. For them, it was another chance to taunt the enemy, vent their frustration, and defy the curfew imposed on much of Gaza and the West Bank by the authorities. In mid-November, Israel once again warned its forces would retaliate against any further disruption. The warning was aimed primarily at Hezbollah fighters in southern Lebanon, but it coincided with a partial Israeli withdrawal from the region following rumors that the peace talks might be adjourned. Thus, Israel showed itself willing to ease pressure on its own peace negotiator. There was no such let-up for their Palestinian counterparts. Fundamentalists, disciples of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, took to the streets to keep the pressure on all sides. As the 6th anniversary of the Intifada approaches, there seems to be no end in sight to the fighting or the bloodletting. Little room for peace. At least not for these people gathered for yet another funeral. That of a young Palestinian in southern Gaza killed at an Israeli army checkpoint. Almost 1,000 people have died since the uprising began. As the protracted peace talks continue, Israel seems increasingly beleaguered both inside and outside its immediate borders. Disillusionment threatens to set in, and many would admit that the chances of a settlement are likely to recede unless Israel agrees to start trading land for peace and acknowledges the Palestinians' right to autonomy.